few videos ago, I held up a box. In fact, it was this miniature right here. And was like, well, the current tariffs from China at 10%, they're not going to be that bad because the production cost of this miniature is basically stupid cheap. However, things have kind of changed since then, and they've changed a lot. So much so that for some, they're calling it the darkest timeline. Now, that's not my words. That is Jamie Stegmaier of Stonemaier Games, but more on that in a little bit. At the moment I'm recording this video, currently the tariffs on China are now up to 145%. And that could very easily change by the time you're watching this because that has changed about 3 times in the past 36 hours. All of this kind of began now about a little over a week ago when President Trump announced the Liberation Day tariffs. Fact sheet: President Donald J. Trump declares national emergency to increase our competitive edge, protect our sovereignty, and strengthen our national and economic security. This is the release where you saw that whole giant chart that the president was holding up with the different tariff rates. And the one thing I want to point out here is this one paragraph. President Trump is invoking his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, IEEPA, to address the national emergency posed by the large and persistent trade deficit that is driven by the absence of reciprocity in our trade relationships and other harmful policies like currency manipulation and exorbitant value-added taxes perpetuated by other countries. Now, this act he's invoking is the same one we saw last time, except that national emergency dealt with illegal immigration and fentanyl and drug cartels and all that kind of stuff. And if you scroll down a bit further in this document, you're going to see here for Canada and Mexico, the existing fentanyl migration, IEEPA orders remain in effect. Basically, all that stuff is still in place at this time. And then things kind of got crazy. Stock market dropped by quite a bit. Retaliatory tariffs came in from several countries. In particular, China started putting tariffs on U.S. goods. Then there was fake news, and maybe they're going to be paused. These tariffs are going to be paused for 90 days, which caused a bump in the stock market. Then it dropped again. And then President Trump came out and said, well, many of the countries are going to go ahead and have their tariffs delayed by 90 days to allow for negotiation. But China is definitely not one of those countries. And the tariffs were basically imposed pretty darn fast after that announcement, for China anyway. So a number of tabletop game companies have released statements on these tariffs. I'm going to go through a few of them. We're going to start with Catalyst Game Labs. We're going to look at this paragraph right here. With the current level of economic uncertainty, we have to make some tough decisions. In the next 60 days, we will be releasing a comprehensive update process, including some unfortunately necessary price adjustments. These price adjustments will be applied to new products and product reprints that are directly affected by the tariffs, But the big thing you want to pay attention to here with this particular announcement is the date, March 7th, 2025. So this statement is from well before all the crap hit the fan. And in case you were curious, Catalyst has not made any further announcements, as you can see right here, about the tariffs. So I imagine in about another 30 days, we'll have some more information here from them, but obviously they're concerned about price increases. Here's an announcement from the company that makes the Gloomhaven franchise. This is on one of their crowdfunding campaigns that are currently being running, and they're talking about tariffs and tabletops. At this point is when the tariffs on China were at 104%. So anyway, you get the idea. There's obviously things are probably getting worse for them. And I want to comment a little bit on this line right here. While this is not intended to be a politically partisan post, tariffs are implemented by elected politicians, constitutionally by Congress, but in this case by emergency claims and executive order of the president. So it'll inevitably be political in nature, but from the agnostic perspective of a small business operator. So I'm going to go on a bit of a personal political rant here. I don't fundamentally disagree with what he's saying there, but Here's the problem, is that Congress has been pretty darn defective for a long time. If we go back to the president's executive order, multiple times now he references the Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. Now, maybe you want to argue that the president is overstepping his authority in this act, but the reality is Congress passed this law to give emergency powers to the president. They have effectively delegated away their ability to check and balance the president as they're supposed to do. So what I would say to do at this point is, if you're upset with these tariffs, call on Congress to repeal this law. Tell them to do their frickin' job and actually hold the president in check, because they have not been doing that for like a long frickin' time. We have been through like 7 major military engagements since the last time we declared war, which once again is a congressionally designated power under the Constitution. Anyway, back to tabletop gaming. The impact that the 104% tariffs, now 145%, will have on our industry and our company are nothing short of devastating, and are already having immediate consequences that will be felt knowingly and unknowingly by everyone who enjoys this industry. From the hobbyist, the retail store owner, the publisher, and ultimately our communities. And then they go on to reference a number of other people who have similar things to say. So this is the darkest timeline comment I referenced at the start of the video by Jamie Stegmaier. At the point he wrote this, we were at a 54% tariff on Chinese goods. So let's just kind of read his statement here. A tariff is a tax paid by the company who owns the goods, the importer of record, i.e. the publisher. If a game costs $10 to make in China, upon receiving that game in the US, the publisher will pay a $5 tax to the US government. Now that'd be about a $15 tax. As a direct result of this tariff, which was calculated based on a trade deficit, within a few months, US companies will lose a lot of money and or go out of business, and the US citizens will suffer from extreme inflation. I can only imagine he's probably not in the best of moods, and clearly not a big fan of this particular strategy the president is taking. And finally, if you're kind of curious, since the last video made in this was dealing with HeroScape, has Renegade said anything about these tariffs? In the time since the major tariffs on China were announced, Renegade has not formally released any sort of news statement. So as mentioned, there are statements from other game companies, and they all kind of follow a similar line, so feel free to go read them if you want to. Now, there's not really a great way to segue this video to some sort of ad, but earlier this year, I did run a successful crowdfunding campaign for my latest set of Fractured Colony 3D printable gaming miniatures, and those miniatures are now available for sale to the general public. So you can head over to fracturedcolony.com and find out where you can purchase those. And here's a quick little sneak peek for set number 3 that'll be coming out later this year. These are some suits of battle armor for the Coordinator Alliance. All right, let's get back to the video. How should I break this all down and kind of analyze things? And the reality is there's a lot going on, and I've made jokes mainly, I think, earlier this year or last year in the Christmas special about societal collapse, and those are sort of jokes because the honest reality is the United States has been facing a whole lot of challenges, not new challenges. So these aren't things that the Trump administration has necessarily created. They've been around for a long time, but I think Trump's policies are really bringing them to light. And these tariffs things are sort of his attempt to go ahead and solve some of these problems. I mean, if you start here, we're looking at a long-term graph of the S&P 500. Pretty much the stock market has been on a more or less bull market trend since about 2008, 2009 with the housing collapse. There were a few blips here, one for COVID, and then down here for that period that was known as Biden economics. Free marketing tip for you guys: don't name something after yourself until you know that's a good thing. Just keep that in mind for the future. And of course, then we have the drop down right here for the current tariff issues. Kind of related to that, if we look at another graph over here, this is the GDP of the United States of America from the Federal Reserve, and once again, it's pretty much been growing for a long time with a slight dip here in the housing market debacle and then a little dip in COVID, and it just keeps going up and up and up. Despite that fact that the economic numbers keep going up, There is a lot of pessimism right now if you really look past just these numbers and the graph that keeps going up. You got this monstrosity of data right in front of you, but the one we want to look at is up here in the upper left-hand corner, which is the U.S. national debt. Currently, the United States government is approaching about $37 trillion in debt, which is absolutely massive. Now, the honest reality is the national debt is a bit of a theoretical problem until it becomes a real problem, and once it becomes a real problem, it's going to become a crisis awfully darn quick. As for what can cause that theoretical problem to become a, well, very serious problem, I don't know, let's take a few guesses here. War with Iran, maybe China invades Taiwan, a Russian missile happens to land in Poland or the Baltic states, and then that area just explodes with even wider spread warfare. There's more social unrest in the United States, caused by who knows what, any number of things, perhaps another global pandemic. So that's not a good situation to be in, and the reason it keeps going up is because the United States runs a massive debt each year. Where you can see that in the year 2023, the United States government spent $6.1 trillion, but only brought in $4.4 trillion. And that's kind of how it's been for the past few years, approximately about an increase of debt of $1.7 trillion per year. So we're spending a lot more money than we're making as a country. So more bad news comes in the fact that the United States has been transitioning away from manufacturing jobs for some time now, and on paper they're going to replace those with high-skilled jobs, and to some extent this is true. I mean, computer programming as well as server administration, all this IT stuff, that wasn't really a widespread career 50 years ago like it is now. There's been some side effects of that. We've got a whole bunch of people, whole bunch of younger people who went to college, got a degree, have massive debt from tuition, and there's not enough high-skilled jobs to basically employ them, and you've got that whole meme of the person with the master's degree working at Starbucks, struggling to get by, and now demanding the government forgives their loan. Then you have to ask the question, well, if the other countries which have a lower standard of living took all of our manufacturing jobs, what's keeping them from taking a lot of our high-skilled jobs as well and basically doing the same stuff with similar quality, but for a lot lower pay rate? And this is where accusations of China come in with basically slave labor type conditions for some of the companies. Now, I'm sure that doesn't apply to every company in China, and I do want to point out that some of the game companies which released these statements did make comments saying they were happy with how the Chinese manufacturers were treating their employees, which is fantastic. That's good. But it doesn't change the fact that China does have a reputation for terrible working conditions, terrible labor laws, and absolutely horrific environmental laws, and all those things result in basically their ability to do things cheaper than us. Then therefore, if you're in the United States, there is a bit of a cognitive dissonance to have the position where you're pro-labor union, pro-fair wage, but a lot of your stuff and a lot of stuff sitting around me is manufactured in a country where none of those things actually exist. And you can say something similar about environmental laws. I personally kind of like having a clean environment because I do enjoy going and swimming in random lakes in the middle of summer. And it's nice not to have to worry about them catching on fire like they did back in the 70s. To be fair, there's a tributary, not actually Lake Erie, but still, you get the point. And then finally, there's that specter of artificial intelligence floating out there that's going to go ahead and possibly steal more high-skilled white-collar jobs. Things looking really peachy, aren't they? I think the hope would be that when manufacturing returns to the United States, these higher-paying jobs means more tax revenue for the government, people have more money to pay for the higher cost of goods, there's going to be more pride in local communities, and there's going to be less welfare payments coming out from the federal government. Also, because these jobs are going to require less education, there's going to be a lot fewer people needing to take out large amounts of debt to go get a college education. And finally, tariffs for things that are not made here, that's going to mean more revenue for the government as well. So can Trump's plan actually work? Well, the math around that government debt I talked about a little bit ago, it's borderline impossible, and there are some other challenges he has to overcome as well. If you go back to Stonemeyer's announcement, they say manufacturing the types of games you make is not an option in the US. People have tried. Even if a company wanted to invest in the infrastructure to try to make it happen, their short-term losses from the tariffs will eat too deep in their cash to make it possible. And he's kind of right about that. China is really well set up for manufacturing these types of products, and that infrastructure and supply chain is not exactly in the United States, but that's because no one has really tried to do it. Obviously, Games Workshop has it going in the UK. Archon Games, who recently announced StarCraft, has a similar production setup going in Poland. And as for companies in the United States, well, there is one trying to get started. The company Best Hobby behind the game Xeogenesis, which is going to be entering crowdfunding soon, has been setting up a US manufacturing pipeline for HIPS miniatures, which are the hard plastic miniatures you're familiar with for games like Warhammer. It's just going to take time for this stuff to be set up in the United States. And yeah, it's going to be a rough period for the tabletop game companies that are still relying on China. And of course, companies that can help you set up that infrastructure are marketing as such. Here is an article from CEOcast, which makes a miniature manufacturing system, talking about how their machines can basically help you set up your own miniature manufacturing to get around the tariffs being implemented on China. And on the topic of AI and terrifying things, they got their little AI slop image up here, their knockoff Transformers with a totally botched up US flag, because that's what AI does to things. Maybe that specter of AI is not quite there yet, but it's coming slowly. And going back to the comments on labor laws and environmental laws, because those are better here in the US, games manufactured in the US are always going to be more expensive than manufactured in China. That's a choice we can make with consumers when it comes to our wallets, and I personally do prefer to buy US manufactured things if that's an option. This guy right here is 3D printed with US manufactured PLA because I think it's a far superior product than the cheap Chinese crap. At least the cheap Chinese crap used to be cheap Chinese crap. I honestly don't know, maybe it's pretty good today, but it used to be terrible back in the day when I started getting 3D printing. But even if we want to get end products manufactured in the United States, this country may not have basically the way to manufacture all the stuff that you need to make the end products. On the topic of buying USA made things, one of the reasons why I like the DeWalt XR line of tools is because many of them are made in the US, but there's a little tag up here that has an important note that says made in the USA with global materials. So there's still going to be some tariffs even for US made goods, because some of the components, well, they're not made in the United States, and that's another challenge that the Trump administration is going to have to deal with over the next few years. And by next few years, well, they got to work pretty fast, because the president has a very tight deadline to turn things around. The midterms are not that far away, about 18 months, and the next Congress is less than 2 years away. If the United States population is really upset, they can vote in different politicians, and all this tariff stuff can get shut down really fast. Or maybe 4 years when we get an entire new presidential administration, and yes, there will be a new administration. It is completely unconstitutional for Trump to run for a third term. Don't worry about it. Who knows what could happen? Maybe that president will continue these policies, or maybe they will get rid of them. And for some companies, if they spent these next 3.5 years setting up the infrastructure and all of a sudden the tariffs are gone, they could be left holding the bag. And once again, people go back to buying cheap imported products from other countries. And yeah, that would end poorly for somebody who's put a bunch of money into US manufacturing potentially. So a lot of pessimism in the tabletop game industry is basically the conclusion of today's video. But we'll see how things go over the next few months and see what happens. This is a volatile situation, and maybe China will come and make a deal and things will calm down a bit. Or maybe, just maybe, the United States will become the great tabletop game manufacturer in the world. I don't know. We'll see a few years from now. You can manufacture stuff in the United States. I've done it for Caladasia, albeit on a relatively limited production run compared to most tabletop games out there. So anyway, thank you guys all for watching. My voice is crapping out here. I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. Check out my miniatures at fracturedcolony.com, and I will see you guys all next time.